The knock came so hard that the jars on Elena Voss's shelf trembled and one nearly rolled to the floor. She caught it with one hand before it shattered, her heart already pounding, because she knew that knock. She had heard it twice before this month, and both times it belonged to the same man. She set the jar down slowly and wiped her hands on her apron before she opened the door. Standing on her step, tall enough that he had to duck slightly under her low doorway, was Damon Ashgrove, Alpha King of Blackthorn. His dark coat was dusted with road dirt, his eyes sharp and searching, as if he expected her to slam the door before he finished a single sentence. "You came again," Elena said, not moving aside to let him in. "I did," Damon answered, "and I will keep coming until you give me a different answer." Behind her, in the small room where herbs hung drying from the ceiling, her daughter Mira sat wrapped in a wool blanket, her cheeks pale, her small chest rising and falling with the effort of breathing. Elena glanced back at her before facing the king again, and something in her chest tightened painfully. "My answer has not changed," she said. "I will not join your court." "I am not asking you to join a court," Damon said, his voice lower now, almost gentle. "I am asking you to let me help a sick child, that is all." Elena's jaw tightened. She had heard offers like this before, wrapped in kindness, dressed up as concern. She knew what happened to women who accepted the help of powerful men. She knew what happened to the families who became useful to kings. Her husband had been useful once, and it had cost him everything. "We manage," she said. "We always have." Damon's gaze moved past her shoulder, toward the girl on the chair, and something flickered across his face, quick and unguarded, gone before Elena could name it. "She does not look like a child who is managing," he said quietly. "That is not your concern. It became my concern the moment I saw her shivering through your window 3 visits ago." His voice was steady, but there was an edge underneath it now, frustration held carefully in check. "You are proud, Elena Voss. I understand pride, I was raised on it, but pride does not lower a fever." Elena felt heat rise in her face, half anger, half something closer to shame. She hated that he was right. She hated more that she could not explain why she could not simply say yes to help freely offered. "You do not know what it means for my family to be tied to yours," she said. "You do not know what happened the last time someone like me trusted someone like you." Something shifted in Damon's expression, curiosity sharpening beneath the concern. "Then tell me." "No." The word came out harder than she intended, final and cold. Damon studied her for a long moment, and she made herself hold his gaze, refusing to look away first, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much her hands were shaking at her sides. "Very well," he said at last. "I will not push you tonight." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small cloth pouch, offering it to her. "Willow bark, ground fine. It will help with the fever until it breaks on its own. No conditions, no debt." Elena stared at the pouch without taking it. "I have willow bark." "Then you have more, and less worry tonight." He set it gently on the small table beside the door, not waiting for her permission. "I will not ask you again this week." He turned to leave, and for a moment, Elena almost called out to stop him, almost asked why a king with a kingdom to run kept walking 3 miles down a muddy road to stand on the step of a woman who turned him away every time. But she said nothing, and the door closed between them with a soft, final click. From the chair by the fire, Mira's small voice broke the silence. "Was that the king again?" Elena turned, forcing her face into something calmer than she felt. "Yes, sweetheart." "He has a nice voice," Mira said, coughing lightly into her blanket. "Why do you always send him away?" Elena knelt beside her daughter's chair, brushing damp hair back from her forehead, checking for fever with the back of her hand out of old habit, even though she already knew the answer. "Because some things that look kind on the outside are not always simple underneath." Mira considered this with the serious face. Only children manage to make about things they do not fully understand. He does not look like he wants anything bad. "Most people who want something do not look like they want something bad," Elena said softly. "That is how they get what they want." She did not tell her daughter about Aldrich. She never did. Mira had been too young when her father died to remember the way he used to whisper reassurances at night that turned out to be lies, the way he had promised there was no danger in the work he did for the neighboring pack, the way he had come home one evening simply not breathing, carried by men who would not meet Elena's eyes, and who disappeared from her life the moment the burial was finished. She had built her whole world since then around one rule: no more promises from powerful men, no more debts that could not be repaid except in grief. That night, after Mira had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Elena sat by the low fire and allowed herself, just for a moment, to open the small cloth pouch Damon had left behind. The willow bark inside was ground finer than anything she could produce with her own mortar, mixed with something else she could not quite identify, something that smelled faintly of clean mountain air and old herbs she had never had access to. She closed the pouch again quickly, as if touching it too long might obligate her to something. She thought of the way he had looked at Mira, quick and quiet, as though the sight of a sick child cost him something private he did not want observed. Kings were not supposed to look at anything that way. Kings looked at maps, at treaties, at armies. Not at a coughing girl wrapped in a blanket in a healer's cottage on the edge of nowhere important. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself it changed nothing. But she slept badly that night, and in her dreams she was standing at Aldrich's grave again, the earth still fresh and dark, and beside her stood a tall shadow she could not quite see the face of, offering her a hand she was too afraid to take. The next morning brought clearer skies and a slightly less feverish Mira, color returning faintly to her cheeks after a full dose of the fresh willow bark. Elena made a note to herself, quiet and grudging, that whatever else the king was, he did not lie about the medicine. Nora, the baker's wife who lived 2 doors down, and who was the closest thing Elena had to a friend in Blackthorn, arrived just after midday with a basket of bread and a look on her face that told Elena gossip had already made its rounds. "The whole village is talking," Nora said, setting the basket on the table without waiting to be invited to sit. "The Alpha King himself, walking down our road 3 times in a month. People are saying all sorts of things." "People should mind their own business," Elena said, though she felt her face warm. "People never do." Nora grinned, though there was genuine curiosity beneath the teasing. "Elena, a king does not walk 3 miles for nothing. Men like that do not have time to waste." "He is not wasting time, he is being stubborn. Or he is interested," Nora said gently, watching Elena's face carefully. "There is no shame in that, you know. Your husband has been gone 5 years. Elena's hands stilled over the bread she was slicing. "This is not about Aldrich. Is it not?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and precise, and Elena did not answer it, because she was not entirely certain what the true answer was. She busied herself instead with the bread, with the fire, with anything that let her avoid Nora's knowing eyes, until her friend finally let the subject drop, and moved on to safer village matters: who had married whom, whose goat had escaped again, whether the harvest would hold through the coming months. But the question stayed with Elena long after Nora had gone home, settling into the quiet corners of her mind, the way unwelcome truths often do, waiting patiently for a moment, when she would be too tired, or too frightened to keep pushing them away. That evening, as she tucked Mira into bed, her daughter reached for her hand with small warm fingers. "Mama," Mira said sleepily, "do you think the king will come back?" Elena smoothed the blanket over her daughter's shoulders, choosing her words with care. "I do not know, little one." "I hope he does," Mira murmured, eyes already closing. "I liked him." Elena sat beside the bed long after her daughter's breathing had evened into sleep, watching the small rise and fall of her chest, thinking of promises that had once sounded exactly this simple, exactly this safe, right up until the moment they were not. She thought of the willow bark, ground finer than anything in her own stores. She thought of the flicker of something unguarded in a king's eyes when he looked at a sick child who was not his own. She told herself again that it changed nothing. But when she finally lay down to sleep that night, some small, traitorous part of her hoped, quietly and against her own better judgment, that he would knock again before the week was through. In the days between his visits, Elena kept herself busy with the ordinary work of the shop, grinding roots, boiling tinctures, wrapping bundles of dried herbs for the villagers who came through her door with aches and coughs and small complaints that had nothing to do with kings or promises. Work had always been her refuge. When her hands were busy, her mind could not wander too far into the past, could not linger too long on graves, or on the sound a door made when a man walked out of it and never came back. She thought of her husband, more in those few days than she had in months. Aldrich had been a quiet man, careful with his words, careful with everything, or so she had believed. He had worked as a go-between for two packs trying to settle an old border dispute, carrying messages neither side trusted to send through their own people. He had told her it was simple, safe work, the kind of thing that ended in a signed paper and a handshake. He had told her there was nothing to fear. She had believed him because she wanted to. That was the part that still stung, even 5 years later. Not that he had lied exactly, but that she had let herself be so easily reassured, so easily folded into a story that was comfortable to believe. When the men brought his body home, none of them had explained what truly happened, only that there had been a disagreement that turned unfortunate, and that it was over now, and that she should take comfort in that. She had not taken comfort in it. She had taken Mira, who was barely more than an infant then, and moved to the far edge of Blackthorn territory, as close to nowhere as she could manage, and built a life small enough that no one important would ever have reason to notice her again, until the Alpha King started knocking on her door. On the second evening after Nora's visit, an old farmer named Oren came into the shop with a swollen ankle and a great deal to say about the king's recent habits. "My boy saw him on the road again," Oren said, wincing as Elena wrapped his ankle in a firm bandage soaked in comfrey. "Alone, no guards, walking like a man, with somewhere important to be." "Is that so?" Elena said, keeping her voice even. "Strange thing, a king, walking alone. Risky too, these days, with the trouble brewing near the eastern border." Oren shook his head. "Some say the Iron Hollow Pack has been testing our borders again. A king ought to have guards with him at all times, especially now." Elena's hands paused over the bandage for the briefest moment, before she continued, filing the information away carefully. She was not part of court politics, had no wish to be, but even she knew that a kingdom simmering with border tension was not a kingdom where its ruler could afford to wander freely, unguarded, toward a healer's cottage 3 miles from anywhere that mattered. And yet he came anyway. That thought unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. A careful man protected himself. A careful king protected his kingdom first, and his own wants a distant second. Whatever brought Damon Ashgrove down that muddy road again and again, it was either carelessness or something he considered worth the risk, and Elena was not certain which possibility frightened her more. She said nothing of this to Mira, who continued to ask, every evening without fail, whether the king might return. Elena gave the same careful non-answer each time, watching her daughter's hopeful face, and feeling the familiar tightness return to her chest, the fear that hope, once allowed to take root, was so much harder to pull out again than it was to plant. By the third day, the willow bark pouch sat empty on the shelf, and Mira's cough had eased to almost nothing, her fever fully broken. Elena told herself this was proof enough that she did not need anything more from the king, that whatever debt she might have felt was settled by simple time and her own steady care. She kept the empty pouch anyway, tucked into a drawer she rarely opened, and told herself it meant nothing, that she had not thrown it away. Nora returned on the fourth day, this time with fewer teasing words and more genuine concern in her voice. "You look tired," she said, studying Elena across the small table. "I am always tired," Elena replied. "It comes with the work. It is not the work that is keeping you up at night, and we both know it." Nora reached over and squeezed her friend's hand briefly. "You do not have to carry everything alone, Elena. You never did." "I have managed alone for 5 years." "Managing is not the same as living," Nora said quietly, and then, seeing the tightness in Elena's face, she let the subject rest, moving instead to safer talk of the coming market day, and whose stall would have the freshest cheese. That night, Elena stood at the window long after Mira had fallen asleep, watching the dark road that led toward the palace, half expecting and half dreading to see a familiar tall shape appear out of the shadows. None came. She told herself she was relieved. She told herself this quiet was exactly what she wanted, the same quiet she had built her whole life around since Aldrich's death, undisturbed and unremarkable and safe. But safety, she was beginning to realize, had started to feel a great deal like loneliness, and she did not know when that change had happened, only that it had, slow and unnoticed, the way a single candle burns down without anyone watching the flame. She was mixing a fresh batch of chamomile and mint for a stomach remedy the next afternoon, her back to the door, when she heard footsteps on the path outside, unhurried, familiar in a way that made her spine straighten before she even turned around. 3 days later, he did. The teacup shattered against the stone floor, before Elena even realized her hand had opened. Damon stood frozen in her doorway, both of them staring at the broken pieces scattered near his boots, and for a moment neither spoke. "I did not mean to startle you," he said finally. "You did not startle me," Elena lied, already kneeling to gather the shards, her fingers trembling slightly as she worked. "I was clumsy." Damon crouched down beside her without asking, helping to collect the broken pieces, despite her murmured protest that he need not trouble himself with something so small. Their hands nearly touched over a piece of blue-painted porcelain, and Elena pulled back quickly, standing before he could see whatever expression had crossed her face in that instant. "You came back," she said, setting the shards on the table, avoiding his eyes. "I told you I would not push you again this week," Damon said, rising to his full height. "This is a new week." Despite herself, Elena felt the corner of her mouth twitch, something close to a smile she fought to suppress. That is a very convenient way to keep a promise. "I am a king. I make the rules I follow." There was warmth in his voice now, a lightness she had not heard from him before, and it disarmed her more than she wanted to admit. "How is Mira?" "Better." Elena glanced toward the back room where her daughter sat with a slate and chalk, practicing her letters, humming quietly to herself. "The fever broke 3 days ago." "Good." Something in his shoulders eased, a tension she had not noticed until it left him. "I am glad." They stood in the small space between them, neither quite finding the next thing to say, until Mira's voice called out from the back room. "Mama, is that the king?" Elena hesitated only a moment before answering. "Yes, sweetheart." There was a scramble of small footsteps, and then Mira appeared in the doorway between rooms, slate still clutched in one hand, her face bright in a way that made Elena's chest ache with a complicated mixture of love and worry. "You came back," Mira said to Damon, delighted, echoing her mother's earlier words without any of the guarded weight behind them. "I did," Damon said, crouching slightly so he was closer to her height. "I hear you have been feeling better." "Mama's medicine worked, and your medicine too." Mira held up her slate proudly. "I have been practicing my letters. Would you like to see?" "Mira," Elena started, feeling the familiar urge to pull her daughter back, to keep this interaction brief and contained. But Damon was already nodding, genuine interest in his face, as Mira showed him the careful, uneven letters she had traced onto the slate. "That is very good work," he said, and he meant it. Elena could hear the sincerity in his voice, the complete absence of the practiced flattery adults so often gave to children. "You have a steady hand." Mira beamed, and something in Elena's resolve wavered further, watching her daughter's face light up under the attention of a man Elena had spent weeks trying to keep at a careful distance. "Would you like tea?" The words left Elena's mouth before she had fully decided to say them, surprising herself as much as, judging by the flicker in his eyes, it surprised Damon. "I would," he said simply. She made the tea with hands that were not entirely steady, aware of him settling onto the small bench near the fire, aware of Mira climbing up beside him without hesitation, chattering about her letters and her favorite stories, and the bird that visited the windowsill each morning looking for crumbs. Damon listened to all of it with a patience Elena had not expected, asking small questions that showed he was truly following the thread of a child's rambling conversation rather than merely enduring it. When Elena finally brought the tea over, she caught Damon watching her rather than Mira, something quiet and unreadable in his expression that made her look away quickly, busying herself with pouring. "You did not have to come today," she said, sitting across from him, keeping the table between them like a small fortification. "I know." "Then why did you?" Damon considered the question longer than she expected, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "Because I find that I think of this cottage more than I think of most rooms in my own palace," he said finally, quiet and honest, in a way that left her without a ready response. "That is not something I am accustomed to admitting." Elena's throat tightened. She did not know what to do with an answer like that, one that offered no hidden motive to distrust, no political angle to guard against, only the plain, uncomfortable truth of a man who had not expected to feel drawn toward a healer's cottage on the edge of nowhere. "You should be careful with words like that," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. "People will talk." "People already talk," Damon said, a wry edge to his voice. "My court has had a great deal to say about my recent habits." "And what do they say?" "That their king has lost his sense," he said, that I am wasting time, better spent on matters of the border, or worse, that I have been charmed by some clever healer, angling for a position at court. He watched her reaction carefully as he said it, and Elena felt her face flush with something between anger and embarrassment. I have asked for nothing from you, she said sharply. I know that, Damon said, gentler now. That is, I suspect, exactly why my advisors find you so difficult to explain. A woman who wants nothing from a king is a rare thing at my court, Elena Voss. Rare enough to be its own kind of danger, in their eyes. Elena said nothing to that, turning her cup in her hands the way he had turned his, the silence between them stretching, but no longer entirely uncomfortable. Mira had wandered back to her slate, humming softly to herself, giving the adults space without seeming to notice she was doing so. Tell me about your husband, Damon said after a while. Careful, not pressing. Simply offering the space for her to fill if she chose. Elena's hands stilled. Why? Because you flinch whenever anything approaching trust comes into a conversation, and I would rather understand why than continue guessing. His voice remained even, without demand in it. You do not have to answer. For a long moment, Elena said nothing, watching the fire crackle low in the hearth, weighing the years of careful silence against the strange, unfamiliar pull she felt to finally set some small piece of that burden down. He worked for the crown, she said finally, quiet and careful, as though testing whether the words would hurt as much spoken aloud as they had felt locked away. Carrying messages between packs during a border dispute. Years ago, he told me it was simple work, safe work. Damon's expression grew still, attentive, in a way that told her he understood more than she had yet said, and it was not. He did not come home one evening, Elena said. They brought him to me instead, and told me there had been a disagreement, and that it was over now. No one ever told me the whole truth of what happened. No one has, to this day. I am sorry, Damon said, and there was nothing performed about it. No practiced condolence offered out of duty. Just quiet, plain regret. I do not tell you this so you will pity me, Elena said, straightening slightly. I tell you, so you will understand why I do not trust easily when it comes to men with power and promises. My husband trusted the crown's word, and the crown's word cost him his life and left Mira without a father. I am not the crown that failed him, Damon said quietly, but I understand why that distinction may not matter to you. It matters, Elena admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. It is only that it is difficult to remember, some days. They sat with that admission between them, neither pushing further, until Mira's chalk slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, breaking the weighted quiet with the ordinary business of a child needing help retrieving a dropped object. By the time Damon finally rose to leave, the sky outside had shifted toward evening, and Elena realized with some surprise that hours had passed since his arrival, hours that had not felt like a burden to endure, but something closer, uncomfortably, to comfort. Thank you for the tea, Damon said at the door, and then, glancing back toward Mira, and for the letters lesson. You have a very bright daughter, Elena Voss. I know, Elena said, and this time, the smile she gave him was not entirely guarded. After he left, Mira climbed into her lap by the fire, small and warm and drowsy with the late hour. I like him, she said sleepily. He listens like he means it. Yes, Elena said softly, stroking her daughter's hair, staring into the fire long after Mira had drifted off. He does seem to, doesn't he? Back at the palace that evening, Damon found his advisor Edwin, waiting in the map room, arms folded, a look on his face that Damon recognized well after years of working alongside him. You were gone most of the day, Edwin said without preamble. I was. At the healer's cottage again. Damon poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher on the long table, unhurried, though he could feel Edwin's eyes tracking his every movement. Yes. That is 4 visits now in a little over a month, Edwin said. The kitchen staff talk, the guards talk. Soon enough the neighboring packs will hear that the Alpha King of Blackthorn spends his afternoons at a common apothecary's fireside, instead of tending to the eastern border, and they will wonder if we are as strong as we claim to be. The eastern border is being handled, Damon said evenly. You have my reports on the matter. I have not neglected a single duty. I did not say you had neglected your duties, Edwin replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. I said that appearances matter, and a king's habits are never entirely his own once he wears the crown. Callum has already begun asking pointed questions about your recent trips. At the mention of his cousin's name, something in Damon's jaw tightened. Callum had never been subtle about his ambitions, though he was careful enough to wrap them in concerned words about the kingdom's welfare, whenever he raised them in open council. Let him ask his questions. He is not the only one asking, Edwin said, softening slightly, some of the old friendship beneath the advisor's formal tone showing through. Damon, I have known you since we were boys. I have never seen you make 4 unnecessary trips anywhere in a month, not for trade, not for treaties, not for anything that did not serve the kingdom directly. So tell me plainly, what is it about this cottage that keeps drawing you back? Damon set down his cup, considering how much of the truth he was willing to share even with a man he trusted as much as Edwin. There is a woman there, he said finally, a widow, with a young daughter who has been unwell. I have provided medicine. That is the whole of it. That is not the whole of it, Edwin said, not unkindly, or you would not have that look on your face right now. What look? The look of a man who has found something he did not expect to find, and does not yet know what to do with it. Edwin studied him a moment longer, then let out a slow breath, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I am not warning you away from her, Damon. I am warning you that others will use this against you, if you are not careful. Callum does not need much to make an argument that you are distracted, unfit, easily led by softness, at a time when the kingdom needs a steady hand at the border. I am aware of what Callum needs, Damon said, quiet but firm. I have been aware of it for years. Edwin nodded slowly, accepting this, though the concern did not fully leave his face. Then be careful how visible your visits become. That is all I ask. Damon considered his advisor's words long after Edwin had left the room, standing alone at the window that overlooked the dark stretch of road leading away from the palace, toward the small cottage where a stubborn healer and her bright, curious daughter waited, whether they wished to admit it or not, for his return. He thought of Elena's careful hands pouring tea, of the guarded honesty in her voice when she finally spoke of her husband, of the particular quiet warmth in Mira's laughter that he found himself missing more than he expected whenever he was away from it. He did not yet have an answer for Edwin's question, not one he was ready to speak aloud, but he knew, standing there in the dim light of the map room, that whatever this was becoming, he had no intention of stopping himself from returning to that cottage again. In her small cottage on the edge of Blackthorn, Elena lay awake, listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, unaware of the conversation taking place in a palace map room 3 miles away, unaware that her name had already become something whispered carefully among men who shaped the fate of kingdoms. She only knew that something had shifted inside her that day, quiet and unwilling, like a door that had been locked for years finally easing open at the hinges, not because anyone had forced it, but because she had finally allowed her own hand to turn the key. She did not sleep well again that night, but for the first time in a long while, it was not fear keeping her awake. Mira's scream tore through the cottage in the dead of night, high and frightened, and Elena was out of bed before she was fully awake, stumbling toward her daughter's small room, with her heart slamming against her ribs. Mira was thrashing weakly under her blanket, skin burning hot to the touch, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Elena pressed a shaking hand to her daughter's forehead, and felt fear close around her throat like a fist. Mira, sweetheart, can you hear me? Mira's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused, and she mumbled something Elena could not understand, before her eyes rolled back and she went limp again. Elena scrambled for the basin of water she kept by the bed, soaking a cloth and pressing it to her daughter's burning skin, her mind racing through every remedy she knew. Willow bark, feverfew, cool water, all of it useless against a fever that had climbed this high this fast. Come on, Elena whispered, her voice cracking. Come on, Mira, stay with me. She tried every tincture on her shelf over the next hour, watching helplessly, as none of them made a difference, as Mira's small body grew hotter instead of cooler, her breathing more labored, her responses fewer and further between. Elena had seen fevers like this only once before, years ago, in a neighbor's child who had not survived the night. The memory sent ice through her veins. She was out of options. She knew it the way she knew the seasons, with a certainty that left no room for denial. Her small shop, for all its careful stock, did not carry what this fever needed. There was only one place in the entire territory that might. Elena wrapped Mira as warmly as she dared, lifted her limp body into her arms, and ran. The road to the palace had never felt longer. Elena's lungs burned. Her arms shook with the effort of carrying her daughter's weight. But she did not stop. Could not stop. Every labored breath from Mira's small body, driving her forward faster than exhaustion could slow her down. When the palace gates finally came into view, lit by torchlight against the dark sky, she nearly collapsed with relief, screaming for the guards before she had even fully reached them. "Please," she gasped. "Please, I need the king. I need help, my daughter." The guards moved quickly, one of them running ahead while the other helped support Elena as her legs threatened to give out beneath her. Within minutes, Damon appeared, still half-dressed as though he had been roused from sleep, his face going white the moment he saw Mira's limp form in Elena's arms. "What happened?" "Fever," Elena managed. "It came on so fast. Nothing is working. Please, I do not know what else to do." Damon did not hesitate. He lifted Mira gently from Elena's exhausted arms and turned toward the palace, calling orders over his shoulder as he moved. "Wake Dr. Hollis. Now." Everything after that blurred into a rush of torchlit corridors and hurried voices. Elena followed close behind, refusing to be separated from her daughter even for a moment, until they reached a warm room where an older man with tired eyes and steady hands was already waiting, medicine bag open on a nearby table. Dr. Hollis examined Mira quickly, checking her breathing, her pulse, the color beneath her eyelids, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "There is inflammation deep in the lungs. Without treatment, within hours." "Then treat her," Elena said, her voice breaking. "Please." "There is a remedy," Hollis said, glancing toward Damon. "Moonflower root, prepared correctly. It is rare, dangerous if measured wrong, but effective. I have a small supply, though I am not certain it is enough for a full course." "Use what you have," Damon said immediately. "Send for more if needed. I do not care what it costs." Elena barely registered his words in that moment, her entire focus fixed on her daughter's small, still form, as Hollis worked with careful, practiced hands, measuring the pale root into a mortar, grinding it fine, mixing it with warm water until it formed a thin paste he coaxed carefully between Mira's lips. The minutes that followed felt endless, Elena gripping the edge of the bed so tightly her knuckles went white, watching for any change, any sign that the medicine was working, any sign at all that she was not about to lose everything that mattered to her in the world. Damon stood close beside her the entire time, saying nothing, offering no false comfort, simply present in a way that Elena found herself grateful for despite everything, despite every wall she had built, specifically, to keep him at a distance from moments exactly like this one. Slowly, gradually, Mira's breathing began to even out. The harsh, ragged gasps softened into something closer to normal sleep. Hollis pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, checking her pulse again, and some of the tension finally left his shoulders. "The fever is breaking," he said. "Slowly, but it is breaking. She will need rest, and another dose before morning, but I believe she will recover." Elena's legs finally gave out, and she sank into the chair beside the bed, pressing both hands over her face, as the tears she had been holding back for hours finally broke free. Damon knelt beside her without hesitation, one hand resting carefully on her shoulder, not pulling her toward him, simply steady and present, letting her have whatever this moment needed to be. "She is going to be all right," he said quietly. "You got her here in time." "I almost did not know what to do," Elena said, her voice thick. "I have herbs for every common illness, every simple fever, but this was beyond anything I have ever treated." "You made the right choice," Damon said. "You ran here, instead of staying and hoping. That is not a small thing." Elena looked up at him, at the genuine relief still evident in his face, at the careful way he had handled every moment of the crisis without once making her feel small or foolish for needing his help, and something in her resistance, built so carefully over 5 long years, cracked further than it ever had before. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I do not know how I would have managed tonight without you." "You do not need to thank me," Damon said. "I would have done the same for any child brought to my door in that condition." Elena studied his face for a long moment, searching for the practiced diplomacy she had expected to find in his answer, and finding instead only plain, simple honesty. "I believe you," she said finally, "and that frightens me more than if I did not." Damon's brow furrowed slightly at that, But before he could ask what she meant, Dr. Hollis interrupted gently, suggesting that Elena rest in the adjoining chamber while Mira slept, promising to wake her the moment anything changed. Elena refused at first, unwilling to leave her daughter's side, until Damon quietly pointed out that exhaustion would serve no one, least of all Mira, who would need her mother steady and rested when she finally woke. Reluctantly, Elena allowed herself to be led to a small chamber nearby, though sleep did not come easily even there, her mind replaying the terror of the night over and over, the desperate run through darkness, the sight of her daughter's limp body in a stranger's capable hands. Near dawn, unable to bear the distance any longer, Elena returned to Mira's room and found Damon still there, seated in the same chair he had occupied hours before, watching over her daughter with quiet, unwavering attention, as though he had appointed himself guardian for the remainder of the night without being asked. "You did not have to stay," Elena said softly from the doorway. "I wanted to," Damon said, not looking away from Mira's sleeping form. "I could not have slept regardless, knowing she was still recovering." Elena crossed the room and sat in the chair beside him, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched, watching her daughter's peaceful, even breathing, with a gratitude too large to fully hold. "This changes nothing," she said quietly, though the words felt weaker now than they had in weeks past. "I still cannot promise you anything beyond tonight." "I have not asked you to promise anything," Damon said gently. "Tonight, I only wanted to help. Tomorrow, we can return to being exactly as careful and complicated as we were before." Despite the exhaustion, despite the fear still lingering in her chest, Elena felt the smallest, most unwilling smile tug at her mouth. "You say that as though it will be easy to simply return to how things were." "I did not say it would be easy," Damon said, finally turning to look at her, something warm and quietly certain in his expression. "Only that I understand you well enough now not to expect it." They sat together in comfortable silence as the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, watching over the sleeping child between them, and for the first time since Aldrich's death, Elena allowed herself to feel, however briefly, something that was not entirely fear. Mira woke shortly after the sun had fully risen, blinking slowly at the unfamiliar ceiling above her, confusion clouding her small face, until her eyes found her mother's, and softened with recognition. "I am here," Elena said, leaning forward immediately, brushing damp hair back from her daughter's forehead, relief flooding through her at the sight of clear, focused eyes, where hours before, there had been only glassy fear. "How do you feel?" "Tired," Mira said, her voice small but steady, a marked improvement from the ragged gasps of the night before. "Where are we?" "The palace," Elena said gently. "You were very sick, sweetheart. We had to come here so the doctor could help you." Mira's gaze drifted past her mother, landing on Damon, who had risen from his chair to give Dr. Hollis room to examine his patient properly. "Did you carry me here?" she asked him. "Your mother did," Damon said, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "She ran the whole way herself. You have a very brave mother." Mira looked at Elena with a kind of wonder that made Elena's chest ache all over again. "You ran the whole way?" "I would run twice as far for you," Elena said softly, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead, and Mira's small hand found hers and held on, weak but certain. Dr. Hollis finished his examination with a satisfied nod, confirming that the fever had broken fully, and that with a few days of rest, Mira would recover completely. "She has a strong constitution," he said, packing away his instruments. "Whatever herbs you have been giving her at home, Elena, they built a good foundation. The moonflower simply finished what your own care had already started." The praise settled something uncertain in Elena's chest, a quiet reassurance that she had not failed her daughter after all, that the years of careful, self-taught skill had counted for something even in a crisis that had ultimately required more than she alone could provide. By mid-morning, arrangements were made for a carriage to carry them both back to the cottage, and Mira wrapped warmly in blankets, and already asking for something to eat, a sure sign of her returning strength. Damon walked with them to the courtyard, quiet but present, and as the carriage was readied, he crouched down to Mira's level once more. "You gave your mother quite a fright," he said gently. "You must promise to rest well and grow strong again." "I promise," Mira said solemnly, and then, with the unguarded honesty only children seem to manage, she added, "Will you visit us again?" "Mama says you might not," but I think you will. Damon glanced up at Elena, something warm and searching in his gaze, before answering. I think your mother knows me well enough by now to expect that I will. Elena said nothing, but she did not correct him either, and as the carriage pulled away from the palace gates, she found herself watching his figure grow smaller through the small window, a tall shape standing alone in the courtyard, until the road curved and he disappeared entirely from view. Word of the night's events did not stay contained within the palace walls for long. By the following afternoon, whispers had already begun moving through the corridors of court, carried by servants who had seen the king himself carry a sick village child through the halls, who had watched him sit vigil at her bedside until dawn, without once summoning an attendant to take his place. In a quiet corner of the map room, Callum listened to these accounts with careful, measured interest, saying little, though the calculation behind his eyes was unmistakable to anyone who knew him well enough to look for it. He said nothing yet, but he filed the information away carefully, the way a man files away any tool he suspects he might one day need, and waited to see what use it might serve him in the days ahead. The council chamber fell silent the moment Damon entered, which told him immediately that whatever conversation had been happening before his arrival had been about him. Continue, he said, taking his seat at the head of the long table. I would rather hear it directly than guess at it from your faces. Callum, seated near the far end, did not hesitate. We were discussing the matter of your recent visits to a village healer, cousin. It seems half the palace staff witnessed you carrying a commoner's child through the halls 2 nights ago, and sitting vigil at her bedside until dawn. The child was gravely ill, Damon said evenly. I offered aid. That is the whole of the matter. Is it? Callum's voice carried just enough concern to sound reasonable, just enough doubt to plant it in the minds of those listening. Forgive me, but a king does not typically carry sick children himself, nor sit through the night at a stranger's bedside, unless something more than simple charity is involved. What exactly are you suggesting? Damon's voice remained level, though something sharp had entered it. I suggest nothing, Callum said smoothly. I merely observe that our border with Iron Hollow grows more tense by the week, that our forces require a steady, focused command, and that a king distracted by matters of the heart may not be the same king this kingdom needs in a time of potential conflict. A murmur moved through the gathered council, and Damon felt the careful trap in Callum's words for exactly what it was, an accusation dressed carefully as concern, impossible to refute directly without seeming to confirm the very distraction being suggested. I have not neglected a single duty since this began, Damon said, addressing the full council now, rather than Callum alone. Every report on the eastern border has been reviewed personally. Every decision regarding our forces has been made with full attention. If any among you believe otherwise, I invite you to bring specific evidence rather than vague insinuation. Edwin, seated near Damon's right, spoke up quietly but firmly. The king's reports have been thorough and timely. I can attest to that personally, having reviewed each one myself before it reached this council. No one doubts the king's diligence with paperwork, Callum said, his tone still maddeningly reasonable. I raise only the question of judgment. A king's choices reflect on the strength of the crown itself. If word spreads to Iron Hollow that our king spends his nights at a common apothecary's bedside rather than among his own guard, what does that suggest to a rival pack already testing our resolve? Damon met his cousin's gaze directly across the table, refusing to look away first. It suggests that their king has compassion enough to save a child's life, without calculating first how it might appear to his enemies. If Iron Hollow considers that a weakness, then they misunderstand what strength actually looks like. Silence followed his words, some of the council members exchanging glances, a few nodding slowly in what might have been quiet agreement, though Callum's expression remained carefully unreadable. Well said, Callum offered eventually, inclining his head, in a gesture that looked like concession but felt, to Damon, like nothing of the sort. I only wished to raise the concern before others less friendly did so first, cousin. You understand. I understand perfectly, Damon said, and the two men held each other's gaze a moment longer before the council moved on to other matters, though Damon noted, with the wary attention of long practice, that Callum said nothing further on the subject for the remainder of the session. Word of the council's discussion reached Elena before the week was out, carried not by Damon himself, but by Nora, who arrived at the shop breathless, with news gathered from her cousin who worked in the palace kitchens. "They say he defended you in open council," Nora said, eyes wide with the drama of it. In front of the whole court, Elena, his own cousin questioned his judgment, and the king stood there and said compassion was not a weakness. Elena's hands stilled over the herbs she was sorting. "He should not have needed to defend anything. I asked for nothing from him." "That is not the point," Nora said gently. "The point is that he chose to, publicly, at some risk to himself. Men do not do that for women who mean nothing to them." Elena said nothing, turning the information over carefully in her mind, feeling the familiar tug between gratitude and fear that had accompanied nearly every interaction with Damon since his first knock on her door. Part of her wanted to dismiss the story as court gossip, exaggerated in the retelling the way such stories always were. But another part of her, quieter and more honest, recognized the shape of what Nora was describing, recognized it as consistent with the man who had sat through an entire night at her daughter's bedside without complaint, without expectation of anything in return. That evening, once Mira had settled into an early sleep, still recovering her strength, Elena sat by the fire turning the empty willow bark pouch over in her hands, the one she had never thrown away. She thought of Aldrich, of the quiet, careful way he had once reassured her that his work for the crown carried no real danger, and she thought of Damon, standing in an open council chamber, refusing to hide or apologize for a choice that had, by every account, been made honestly and without calculation. The two men felt nothing alike, she realized, slowly, turning the thought over with the same careful attention she gave to measuring dangerous herbs. Aldrich had reassured her with words designed to end her worry quickly, smoothing over danger rather than confronting it. Damon, by contrast, had never once tried to convince her that his visits carried no risk, had never minimized the political cost of his choices. He had simply made them anyway, openly, and let her see the consequences, rather than hiding them from her. She did not know what to do with that distinction, only that it unsettled the careful walls she had built for 5 years. Walls constructed around the belief that all men with power eventually asked for more than they gave. That trust extended toward crowns and kings, inevitably ended in graves and unanswered questions. 3 days later, Damon returned to the cottage, and this time Elena did not hesitate at the door before letting him in. "I heard about the council," she said, once he was settled at the small table, once Mira had greeted him with her usual delighted enthusiasm, before returning to her letters by the fire. "You did not have to defend me." "I was not defending you," Damon said. "I was defending the truth of what happened. There is a difference, though I understand why it might look the same from where you stand. Your cousin sounds troublesome." "Callum is many things," Damon said, a wry, tired edge entering his voice. "Troublesome is perhaps the gentlest word for it. He has wanted the crown for himself since we were boys, and he is patient enough to wait for opportunities rather than force them. And you believe my presence in your life has given him one." Damon considered this honestly, rather than rushing to reassure her. "Perhaps," he admitted, "but I would rather face whatever opportunity he finds in this than pretend I do not wish to keep returning to this cottage simply to avoid giving him ammunition." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the calculation she still half expected to find there, the hidden angle, the careful political maneuvering dressed up as honesty. She found none of it, only plain, steady sincerity, and something in her chest, some old and stubborn guard she had maintained for 5 long years, eased just slightly further. "I still do not know what I am doing, letting you sit at my table," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Neither do I, entirely," Damon admitted, a small, genuine smile touching his mouth. "I find I am simply choosing to do it anyway." Across the room, Mira glanced up from her slate, watching the two adults with the quiet, careful attention of a child who understood far more than either of them realized, a small, thoughtful expression settling over her face that neither Elena nor Damon noticed in that moment, though it would matter a great deal before the week was through. Later that evening, after Damon had gone and the cottage had settled into its familiar quiet, Elena found Mira sitting at the small table with her slate pushed aside, a piece of scrap parchment in front of her instead, chewing thoughtfully on the end of her chalk. "What are you working on?" Elena asked, setting a cup of warm milk beside her daughter. "Nothing," Mira said quickly, sliding the parchment beneath her arm with a swiftness that struck Elena as slightly unusual, though she thought little of it at the time, assuming it was simply the ordinary secrecy of a child working on a drawing or a private game. "All right," Elena said, choosing not to press, though she smiled to herself at her daughter's sudden seriousness. "Do not stay up too late. You are still recovering." "I will not," Mira promised, and true to her word, she tucked the parchment carefully away in the small wooden bird Elena had carved for her years earlier, a simple toy, with a hollow belly that opened at the base, before climbing into bed and falling asleep almost instantly, worn out from a day that had felt, for the first time in weeks, entirely ordinary. Elena did not think to ask what her daughter had been writing. She had no reason to suspect anything beyond the usual small mysteries of childhood, and so she let the moment pass without further thought, banking the fire low and settling into her own bed, with her mind occupied instead by thoughts of council chambers and cousins with patient ambitions, of a king who chose honesty over convenience, even when it cost him standing among his own advisors. Meanwhile, in a private chamber within the palace, Callum sat alone with a cup of wine he had barely touched, turning the day's council session over in his mind, with the same careful patience he brought to every calculation. Damon's defense of the healer had been public, direct, and difficult to argue against on its face, but Callum had learned long ago that public defenses often created private vulnerabilities, cracks that widened slowly over time, if pressure was applied in the right places. He summoned a servant quietly, a young man named Fenwick, who had proven useful before, in matters requiring discretion rather than official channels. "I want to know everything about the healer at the edge of the territory," Callum said. "Her name, her history, her late husband, anything that might explain why our king finds her so compelling." "Her name is Elena Voss," Fenwick said, already familiar with the basic gossip circulating through the palace. "Widow. Her husband died some years ago, I believe in service to the crown, though the details are not widely known." Something in Callum's expression sharpened at that. "Find out the details," he said. "All of them. If her husband died in service to this crown, there may be a story there worth understanding, one way or another." Fenwick bowed and departed, and Callum returned to his wine, a slow, considering smile touching his mouth. He did not yet know what he might find, but he had learned that every family carried some story worth uncovering, some old wound that could be pressed at exactly the right moment to serve whatever purpose required it. If Damon intended to keep this widow and her child close, then Callum intended to know everything about them worth knowing, and to hold that knowledge in reserve until the day it proved useful. He had waited years already for the crown to fall into his hands through patience rather than force. He saw no reason to abandon that patience now, only to sharpen it, the way a careful craftsman sharpens a blade he intends to use eventually, regardless of how long the waiting takes. Outside his window, the palace grounds settled into darkness, torchlight flickering along the outer walls, where guards kept their quiet watch, unaware of the slow, deliberate plans taking shape within the walls they protected. Somewhere beyond those walls, along a dark road leading toward the edge of the territory, a small cottage stood peaceful and unguarded, its occupants sleeping soundly, entirely unaware that a storm had already begun gathering around them, patient and unhurried, waiting only for the right moment to break. The wooden bird was gone from its usual shelf, and Mira's small hands searched frantically through her room, pulling blankets aside, checking under the bed, her breath coming faster with each empty space she uncovered. "Mama, have you seen my bird?" Elena looked up from the trade ledger she had been reviewing at the table, the one where she recorded which herbs and remedies she sent out with the trade caravan each month, in exchange for supplies she could not grow or gather herself. "Your wooden bird? I have not touched it, sweetheart. Where did you leave it last?" "On my shelf," Mira said, her voice tight with worry that seemed to Elena disproportionate to a simple missing toy. "I need it back. Please help me look." They searched the small cottage together for the better part of an hour, checking every shelf, every corner, every place a small wooden toy might have been tucked away or knocked loose. But the bird did not turn up. Elena finally sat back on her heels, studying her daughter's distressed face with growing concern. "Mira, it is only a toy. We can look again tomorrow in better light. Why does this particular bird matter so much tonight?" Mira's face went carefully blank in a way that Elena recognized immediately as the expression of a child hiding something, though she could not begin to guess what. "It is just my favorite," Mira said finally, unconvincingly. "You made it for me." Elena let the explanation stand, though something about her daughter's evasiveness lingered uncomfortably in the back of her mind as she tucked Mira into bed that night, promising a more thorough search in the morning. She had no way of knowing, and would not learn for several more days, exactly what had happened to the small wooden bird, or how far it had already traveled from her cottage. 3 days earlier, when the trade caravan had come through collecting goods bound for the palace storerooms, Elena had packed a crate of dried herbs and remedies, alongside a small basket of mended linens she had agreed to send along as a favor to Nora, whose cousin worked in the palace kitchens. In the rush of the caravan's brief stop, with Mira underfoot and the crate only half sorted, the small wooden bird, left forgotten on the kitchen table after Mira had been playing with it that morning, had been swept up along with a bundle of cloth and packed away without anyone noticing. It traveled the 3 miles to the palace, tucked between folded linens, arrived among a dozen other crates delivered to the kitchen storerooms, and sat unnoticed for 2 full days, until a young kitchen servant, sorting through the delivery to separate goods bound for different parts of the palace, found the small carved bird nestled among the linens and, uncertain what to do with an obviously handmade toy that did not belong to any of the goods on the manifest, set it aside on a shelf near the servants' entrance, intending to ask around about its owner when time allowed. It was there, 3 days later, that Damon happened to pass through on his way to a private meeting, recognizing the careful, simple carving immediately, having seen the very same bird sitting on Mira's shelf during his visits to the cottage. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands, intending simply to arrange for its return, when his fingers found the small seam at its base where the hollow belly opened. He should have simply closed it again and sent it back unopened. He told himself this later, more than once, in the quiet hours, when he replayed the moment in his mind. But curiosity, and something less easily named, made him ease the small wooden door open instead, and inside, folded carefully into a small, tight square, he found a piece of parchment, covered in a child's careful, uneven handwriting. He carried it to a quiet corner near the servants' entrance before he unfolded it, some instinct telling him this was not meant for careless eyes, and read the words Mira had written with more care and more longing than any child her age should have needed to carry alone. "Dear King Damon," the note began, "I hope you are not angry that I am writing to you. I do not know if birds can carry letters the way stories say, but I am putting this one in my bird anyway, because I do not know another way to send it. Mama is happy when you visit. She smiles more than she used to, even when she pretends she is not smiling. I do not think she knows I notice, but I do. I remember when Papa died, even though I was very small, because Mama used to cry at night when she thought I was asleep, and she does not do that as much anymore since you started coming. I know Mama is scared. I do not know exactly why, but I think it is because she is scared of losing someone again, the way she lost Papa. I do not want her to be scared anymore. I want her to stop being alone, and I do not want you to stop coming, even though Mama keeps telling you no. Please keep coming back, even when Mama sends you away. I think she wants you to come back too, even when she says she does not. Please do not give up on her. Love, Mira." Damon read the letter twice, then a third time, standing very still near the servants' entrance, while palace life moved busily around him, oblivious to the way the small, careful words of a 6-year-old girl had settled into his chest, with a weight he had not expected, and did not immediately know how to hold. He thought of every visit to the cottage, every careful conversation with Elena where she had insisted, again and again, that this changed nothing, that she could not promise him anything, that her caution came from somewhere old and painful she was not yet ready to fully share. He had understood, in a general way, that grief and fear shaped her resistance. He had not understood, until this moment, holding proof of it written in a child's careful hand, exactly how closely her daughter had been watching, exactly how much Mira had absorbed of her mother's private sorrow, despite Elena's best efforts to shield her from it. He folded the letter back into its careful square, and returned it to the hollow belly of the wooden bird, closing the small door with hands that were not entirely steady. He did not yet know what to do with what he had learned. Part of him wanted to ride to the cottage immediately, to sit Elena down and tell her everything, to lay the whole truth of her daughter's hidden hope on the table between them, and see what came of it. But a larger, more careful part of him recognized that this was not a truth to be delivered carelessly, not when it touched something as fragile and as guarded as Elena's grief. He carried the bird to his own chamber that evening, and set it on the table beside his bed, unable to simply hand it off to a servant for return, as though nothing about it had changed. He sat with it for a long while, turning over everything he now understood, piecing together fragments of conversations that made new sense in light of what Mira had written. Elena's careful silence about her husband's death, her insistence that his interest frightened her more than reassured her, her repeated refusals that had never, he now realized with a growing weight in his chest, been about rejecting him personally at all. Something else troubled him as well, a detail buried within Mira's letter that he found himself returning to again and again. Mira had written that her mother was scared, but she had not simply said scared of losing someone. She had said scared of losing someone again, the way she lost her father, and Damon found himself wondering, for the first time with real unease, exactly how her father had died, and whether the story Elena had shared with him, a simple account of a border dispute gone wrong, was truly the whole of it. He resolved, sitting alone in the quiet of his chamber, with a child's letter closed away in a small wooden bird beside him, that before he returned this bird to its rightful owner, he would understand fully what he was choosing to step into. Not to use the knowledge against Elena, never that, but because a man could not properly protect what he did not fully understand, and something in his instincts, sharpened by years of court politics and careful listening, told him that Elena Voss carried a danger in her past, far larger than a simple accident during trade negotiations. He did not sleep well that night, his mind turning over old records he intended to request first thing in the morning, records of a border dispute 5 years past, records of a man named Aldrich Voss, whose death had never been fully explained, even to the wife left behind to raise their daughter alone. Somewhere at the edge of the territory, Mira slept soundly in her small bed, unaware that her secret letter had already found its intended reader, unaware of how close her quiet wish was about to come to changing everything, for better and for worse, in ways far larger than a lonely mother and a missing wooden bird. The next morning, Mira's worry over the missing bird had not eased, and she searched the cottage again before breakfast, checking every shelf twice, growing quieter and more withdrawn, as each search turned up nothing. Elena watched her daughter's growing distress with concern, setting aside her own morning tasks to help look, though privately she suspected the toy had simply been misplaced during play and would turn up eventually in some overlooked corner. "I am sure it will find its way back to you," Elena said gently, kneeling to check beneath the low bench near the fire. "Toys have a habit of turning up when we least expect it." "You do not understand," Mira said, her voice small and unusually serious for a child discussing a missing plaything. "It is important. I need it back." "I know it is your favorite," Elena said, misreading the depth of her daughter's worry as simple childish attachment. "We will keep looking, I promise." Mira said nothing further, retreating into a quiet, subdued mood that lasted through breakfast and into the morning's chores, and Elena found herself puzzled by the unusual intensity of her daughter's reaction, though she attributed it, not unreasonably, to the lingering fragility of a child, still recovering from serious illness, more easily unsettled than usual, by small disruptions to her ordinary world. Later that day, Nora stopped by with news from her cousin at the palace kitchens, mentioning offhand that the recent trade delivery had arrived safely, the linens sorted and stored, the herbs already distributed to the palace healers who had been grateful for the fresh supply. Elena listened with only half her attention, her mind still occupied with her daughter's strange distress over the missing toy, until a small detail in Nora's account caught her notice. "Your basket of mended linens went out with the crate of herbs, did it not?" Nora asked. "My cousin said the kitchen staff found all sorts of odds and ends mixed in when they unpacked it. Nothing important, just the usual mess of a rushed delivery." Elena's hands stilled over the herbs she had been sorting, a slow, uncomfortable realization beginning to take shape. "Odds and ends," she repeated carefully. "What sort of odds and ends?" "I did not ask for details," Nora said, shrugging, unaware of the sudden tension in her friend's posture. "Why, does it matter?" Elena thought of the kitchen table 3 days earlier, of Mira playing with her wooden bird while Elena hurried to finish packing the crate before the caravan departed, of the general chaos of that particular morning, herbs and linens, and a distracted child, all tangled together in the rush. She thought of the moment, days later, when Mira had discovered the bird missing, distressed in a way that seemed, in hindsight, far too intense for an ordinary lost toy. "I need to speak with your cousin," Elena said slowly, setting down the herbs entirely now, her full attention fixed on the growing suspicion taking shape in her mind. As soon as possible. That night, Elena sat awake, long after Mira had finally settled into sleep, turning over every possibility in her mind, uncertain whether to feel foolish for suspecting something so serious over a simple misplaced toy, or uneasy for reasons she could not yet name. She had no way of knowing that her instincts, sharpened by years of careful watchfulness, had led her precisely to the truth, only a few days too late to change what had already happened. Somewhere beyond the dark road that separated her cottage from the palace, a king sat with a child's letter, and a growing understanding of the woman he had been so carefully, patiently pursuing, and neither of them yet knew how the other's night was unfolding, though both lay awake with hearts too full, and minds too restless for easy sleep. But by the time Elena managed to send word through Nora's contacts at the palace, 3 more days had already passed. Days during which the small wooden bird sat quietly on a table in the king's private chamber, its secret contents already read and understood, its owner's mother still entirely unaware of what her daughter had written, or to whom it had already been delivered. Edwin found the sealed record on Damon's desk before Damon had a chance to hide it, and his face went carefully blank the moment he read the name on the cover. Aldrich Voss, Edwin said slowly, setting the folder back down exactly where he had found it. That is not a name I expected to see cross your desk again. Damon looked up from the window where he had been standing, arms crossed, his expression tired in a way that told Edwin he had not slept much the previous night. You know something about him. I know the official record, Edwin said carefully. Same as anyone who reviewed the border dispute files from 5 years past. Why the sudden interest? Damon considered how much to share, weighing his own need for answers against the risk of exposing Elena's private grief before he understood its full shape. I have reason to believe the official record may not be complete, he said finally. I need everything, Edwin. Every witness statement, every report filed by the men who were present that day. I do not care how old the files are, or how deeply buried. Edwin studied him for a long moment, clearly recognizing that something more personal than administrative curiosity was driving the request. Though he did not press for details Damon was not yet ready to give. I will see what I can find, he said. Give me 2 days. It took 3. When Edwin finally returned, he carried a thin stack of documents that told a story considerably more complicated than the simple, tragic account Elena had believed for 5 long years. Aldrich Voss did die during the border negotiations with Iron Hollow, Edwin said, laying the documents out across the table. But the official cause, a disagreement that turned violent between the 2 negotiating parties, does not match what I found buried in the guard reports filed immediately afterward. Damon leaned forward, reading quickly through the pages, his jaw tightening as the true shape of the story emerged. Aldrich Voss had not died in a spontaneous dispute at all. He had been carrying evidence, documentation, proving that a member of Blackthorn's own court had been secretly feeding information to Iron Hollow, undermining the very negotiations he had been trusted to help conduct. Someone within Blackthorn's own ranks had learned what Aldrich carried, and had ensured he never delivered it, arranging for his death to appear as an unfortunate consequence of the negotiations themselves, rather than what it truly was, a deliberate silencing. Who arranged it? Damon said quietly, though something cold and certain was already forming in his chest before Edwin even answered. The reports were never fully investigated, Edwin said carefully. The matter was closed quickly, chalked up to the general volatility of border disputes, but one name appears repeatedly among the guards assigned to the negotiation party that day, a young officer who oversaw the security arrangements and who happened to be conveniently absent at the exact moment Aldrich Voss was killed. Damon already suspected the name before Edwin said it, some old instinct sharpening into certainty as he read further down the page. Callum. His name appears in the assignment records, Edwin confirmed. I want to be careful here, Damon. This is not definitive proof of anything. It is a pattern, a set of circumstances that raise serious questions, but questions are not the same as answers. It is enough to explain why the truth was buried so quickly, Damon said, his voice low and controlled despite the anger building beneath it. My own cousin allowed an innocent man to die, and let a widow believe for 5 years that it was nothing more than an accident of politics, because the truth would have exposed his own betrayal of this crown. If it is true, Edwin said carefully, then you understand the danger of moving against him without absolute certainty. Callum has spent years building support among the older council members. An accusation this serious, made without ironclad proof, could tear this court apart, or worse, hand him exactly the crisis he would need to justify moving against you directly. Damon closed his eyes briefly, forcing himself to think past the immediate anger toward something more useful. Edwin was right, however much it frustrated him to admit it. A 5-year-old suspicion built from incomplete reports was not enough to bring down a man as carefully positioned as Callum. He would need more, clear evidence, ideally, something that connected Callum directly to the betrayal itself, rather than merely to a convenient absence during a tragedy. "Keep this quiet," Damon said finally. "I do not want Callum aware that anyone is looking into this again. Not yet." "And Elena?" Edwin asked carefully. "Will you tell her what you have found?" Damon considered the question for a long moment, thinking of the letter still resting in the small wooden bird beside his bed, thinking of Mira's careful, hopeful words about her mother's grief, thinking of everything Elena had endured for 5 years, believing her husband's death was simply an accident of dangerous work, rather than a deliberate silencing, arranged by someone who still sat, even now, at the king's own council table. "Not until I understand the whole truth," he said finally. "She deserves more than fragments and suspicion. If I tell her Callum may be responsible, I need to be certain enough to also tell her what will be done about it." Edwin nodded slowly, gathering the documents back into their folder. "There is something else you should consider," he said, pausing at the door. "If this suspicion is correct, then Elena and her daughter may not simply be connected to your personal interests, Damon. They may be connected to a truth Callum has spent 5 years successfully burying. If he learns that you are looking into Aldrich Voss's death again, and that your interest traces back to the widow you have been visiting so frequently, he may see her not merely as a distraction to use against you politically, but as a genuine threat to expose something he cannot afford to have uncovered." The weight of that realization settled over Damon slowly, reframing everything he had assumed about the danger surrounding Elena and Mira. He had thought, until this moment, that the greatest risk facing them was simply court gossip, whispered doubts about his judgment, the kind of political friction that could be managed with careful patience. Now he understood that the danger ran considerably deeper, that a woman who had spent 5 years believing herself merely unlucky in love and loss might, in fact, be sitting on knowledge, however unknowing, that threatened to unravel a conspiracy, still actively protected by someone with every reason to ensure it stayed buried. He thought of Elena's careful, guarded refusals, her insistence that trusting powerful men had already cost her everything once before. She had believed she was protecting herself and Mira from the ordinary dangers of court entanglement. She had no idea that the true danger she had been running from for 5 years was still very much alive, still sitting in a position of power within the very court she had worked so hard to avoid. That evening, Damon returned to his chamber and lifted the small wooden bird from the table beside his bed, turning it over carefully in his hands. He thought of writing to the cottage immediately, of telling Elena everything he now understood, but he forced himself to wait, recognizing that acting too quickly, before he had gathered enough certainty to act decisively against Callum, risked exposing Elena to a danger he was not yet prepared to fully protect her from. Instead, he made a decision that felt, in the moment, both necessary and deeply uncomfortable. He would continue gathering evidence quietly, patiently, the way Callum himself had always operated, until he had enough proof to act, without risking a political crisis that could leave Elena and Mira more exposed rather than less. And in the meantime, he would return the small wooden bird to its owner, though he found he could not yet bring himself to reveal that he had read what it contained, not until he understood fully what protecting Elena would require of him. He wrapped the bird carefully in cloth and set it aside for the next morning's visit, aware, as he finally settled into a restless sleep, that whatever came next would change everything between himself and Elena Voss, one way or another, and that there would be no simple return to the careful, guarded distance she had maintained for so long, not now that the truth of her husband's death and the depth of her daughter's hidden hope both rested so heavily on his conscience. He arrived at the cottage the following afternoon, carrying the small bundle carefully, and Elena opened the door with a mixture of relief and unease that he did not fully understand until she spoke. "I was going to send word to the palace today," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "We seem to have misplaced something in the last trade delivery. Mira's wooden bird. It has been missing for nearly a week, and she has been beside herself over it. Damon felt the careful weight of the bundle in his hands, and chose his next words with more caution than he had used in a long while. "It seems fortune has arrived ahead of your errand," he said, holding out the cloth-wrapped bird. "It was found among the linens delivered to the kitchen stores." One of the staff set it aside, uncertain who it belonged to. Relief broke across Elena's face as she took the bird from him, turning it over in her hands to check it for damage, unaware of the small seam at its base, unaware of what had passed through that hollow space in the days since it left her cottage. "Mira will be so relieved," she said. "She has hardly spoken of anything else." "May I ask why it matters so much to her?" Damon said carefully, watching Elena's face for any sign that she already suspected what the bird had carried. "I do not entirely know," Elena admitted, setting the bird on the table. "She has been unusually protective of it these past weeks. I assumed it was simply attachment, the sort of thing children form toward favorite toys, especially one I made for her myself." Damon said nothing further on the subject, though the weight of what he knew pressed uncomfortably against his conscience, as Mira came rushing from the back room at the sound of voices, her face lighting with pure relief at the sight of her bird returned safely to the table. "You found it," she said, snatching it up and holding it close, checking the small hinge door at its base, with quick, careful fingers, relief visibly flooding through her, as she confirmed whatever she needed to confirm. Damon watched this small ritual with a tightness in his chest, understanding now exactly what she had been checking for, and grateful, in a complicated way he did not examine too closely, that he had returned it before her worry grew any deeper. "Where was it?" Mira asked, looking between the two adults. "It traveled to the palace by accident," Damon said gently. "Packed in with some linens, I believe. It has been well cared for in the meantime." Mira studied him for a moment with an expression that seemed, to Damon's uneasy conscience, far too perceptive for a child her age, though she said nothing more about it, simply hugging the bird close and thanking him with the same open sincerity she brought to everything. Elena, watching the exchange, felt something small and unplaceable shift in the air between the king and her daughter, a weight to the moment she could not quite name, though she attributed it, in the end, to her own exhaustion and the lingering worry of the past week, rather than anything more significant. She had no reason yet to suspect that the return of a simple wooden toy carried anything beyond the relief of a missing plaything finally found. That evening, after Damon had gone and Mira had fallen asleep with the wooden bird tucked protectively against her chest, Elena sat by the fire turning over the strange quality of his visit, the careful way he had asked about the bird's importance, the unusual quiet that had settled over him throughout the afternoon. She told herself it was simply the ordinary weight of court matters pressing on him, the same burdens that had brought Callum's pointed questions into open council weeks before. She did not yet know how close she had come to learning the truth that evening, nor how carefully Damon had guarded it from her, not out of deception, but out of a fierce, still-forming determination to protect her from a danger she did not yet know she carried. In his own chamber that night, Damon stood again at the window overlooking the dark road toward the cottage, the weight of everything he now understood settling heavily across his shoulders. He thought of Mira's small, careful hands checking the hidden seam of her bird, unaware that the letter still rested exactly where she had left it, its message read, but its secret otherwise undisturbed. He thought of Elena's quiet exhaustion, unaware that the true shadow over her life was not simply grief, but a danger still walking the halls of his own palace, wearing a familiar, trusted face. Whatever came next, he knew now, would require more courage and more care than anything he had yet risked in the weeks since his first knock on her door. The old guard's hands shook as he set down his cup, and Damon knew immediately that whatever Garrick was about to say had waited 5 years to be spoken aloud. "You said you wanted the truth about the border negotiations," Garrick said, his voice low, glancing toward the closed door of the small tavern room Damon had arranged for their private meeting. "I have carried this a long time, my king. I did not think anyone would ever ask." "I am asking now," Damon said, keeping his own voice steady, despite the tension coiling tighter in his chest. "Whatever you saw that day, I need to hear all of it." Garrick had served as a junior guard during the Iron Hollow negotiations 5 years earlier, one of the men assigned to escort Aldrich Voss during the final exchange of documents. He had never been questioned formally about the events of that day, his account buried among dozens of similar statements taken in the chaotic aftermath. None of them examined closely once the official explanation of a violent disagreement had been accepted and the matter declared closed. Aldrich was not killed by anyone from Iron Hollow, Garrick said finally, the words coming slow and careful, as though he had rehearsed them many times in his own mind, without ever expecting to speak them aloud. I saw him struck down by one of our own, my king. A young officer who had arrived only that morning, with new orders regarding security for the exchange. Callum, Damon said quietly, though it was not truly a question. Garrick's silence confirmed it. I did not know his full name then, only his rank and his authority over our unit that day. I saw him take Aldrich aside, away from the main negotiating party, saw them exchange words I could not hear from my position. Moments later, Aldrich was dead, and the story quickly became that Iron Hollow's men had turned violent during a dispute over terms. No one asked me what I had actually witnessed. I was young, frightened, and grateful, may the goddess forgive me, that no one asked. Why did you never come forward? Damon asked, though he asked it gently, understanding the weight of fear that had likely kept an ordinary guard silent for so many years. Because within a week of the incident, I was quietly reassigned to a border post at the far edge of the territory, Garrick said, bitterness creeping into his voice for the first time. A promotion, officially, a convenient way to ensure I was far from anyone who might ask questions, unofficially. I understood the message clearly enough, even without anyone stating it directly. Silence was rewarded. I imagined speaking would not have been. Damon absorbed this slowly, the shape of Callum's careful cruelty coming into sharper focus with each new piece of evidence. Not only had his cousin arranged Aldrich Voss's death to hide his own betrayal of the crown, he had also methodically silenced the one witness capable of exposing what truly happened, burying the truth under years of careful, patient management. Would you be willing to give a formal statement? Damon asked. Before the full council, if necessary. Garrick's face paled slightly, old fear visible even after 5 years of distance. That is a dangerous request, my king. If Callum learns I have spoken, you will have my protection, Damon said firmly. Full and direct, I will not ask you to risk your safety without ensuring it. Garrick considered this for a long moment, weighing old fear against what Damon suspected was a long-buried desire for the truth to finally see daylight. For Aldrich Voss's widow, he said finally, quiet but resolved, and for his daughter, who deserves to know her father died protecting this kingdom's honesty, not because of some meaningless dispute. Yes, I will speak the truth, whatever it costs me. Damon left the meeting with the first piece of solid, testifiable evidence, connecting Callum directly to Aldrich's death, though he understood clearly that a single witness statement, however credible, might not be enough on its own to move decisively against a man who had spent years building careful alliances throughout the council. He would need more, and he suspected time was growing shorter than he wished, given how actively Callum had already begun making inquiries about Elena's past. That suspicion was confirmed within days, when Edwin arrived at Damon's chamber, with news that darkened his expression considerably. Callum has been asking questions, Edwin said without preamble. Discreetly, but persistently. About Elena Voss, about her late husband, about the exact circumstances of his death. My contacts within the household staff tell me he has sent at least one servant to make inquiries at the village where she once lived, before relocating to her current cottage. Damon's jaw tightened. He suspects she knows something. Or he fears you have already told her something, Edwin said. Either way, if he believes she poses any risk to what he has spent 5 years hiding, he will not hesitate to act against her, quietly and deniably, the same way he acted against her husband. The full weight of the danger settled over Damon with sudden, sharp clarity. Whatever careful patience he had intended to bring to gathering evidence against Callum, he no longer had the luxury of unlimited time. Elena and Mira were no longer simply people he wished to protect out of personal feeling. They were now, in Callum's calculating mind, a genuine liability, one he had already proven himself willing to eliminate once before. I need to warn her, Damon said, already moving toward the door. Tonight. Damon. Edwin's voice stopped him before he reached it, urgent and careful. If you ride to her cottage now, alone, without adequate protection, and Callum has already positioned anyone to watch her, you may draw exactly the attention we are trying to avoid. Take guards. Do this carefully, or you may put her in more danger, not less. Damon forced himself to pause, the urgency in his chest warring against the sense of Edwin's caution. "Then arrange it," he said finally, quietly, but quickly. "I will not leave her unprotected another night longer than necessary." Edwin nodded and moved to gather a small, trusted escort, and within the hour, Damon rode toward the cottage, at the edge of the territory, with 4 guards flanking him, his mind turning over how much of the truth he now owed Elena, and how carefully he would need to deliver it, without breaking whatever fragile trust had grown so slowly between them over the past weeks. He found her still awake despite the late hour, a single candle burning in the window, and something in her face shifted to immediate alarm the moment she saw the guards accompanying him. "What has happened?" she asked, pulling the door open before he had even reached it. "Nothing has happened yet," Damon said, stepping inside quickly, gesturing for the guards to take quiet positions outside. "But I need to speak with you about your husband, Elena, about what truly happened to him 5 years ago." Elena went very still, her hand tightening on the edge of the door. "What do you mean, what truly happened?" Damon drew a slow breath, choosing his next words, with the same careful weight he had given every decision since Garrick's confession. "I mean that the story you were told was not the truth. Aldrich did not die in a dispute with Iron Hollow. He died because he uncovered a betrayal within my own court, and someone silenced him to keep that betrayal hidden." The color drained slowly from Elena's face, old grief and fresh shock warring visibly across her features. "Who?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who did this?" Damon met her eyes steadily, understanding that the name he was about to speak would change everything, not only for Elena, but for the fragile, uncertain future he had begun to hope might exist between them. "My cousin," he said quietly, "Callum, and I believe, given how actively he has begun asking questions about you and Mira, that he now sees you both as a threat that needs to be dealt with, the same way he dealt with Aldrich." Elena's legs seemed to give way beneath her, and she sank into the nearest chair, her hands pressed over her mouth. 5 years of unanswered grief and unexplained loss, finally finding a shape she had never expected, a betrayal far closer to the crown than she had ever imagined possible. "He killed my husband," she said, the words shaking as she spoke them aloud for the first time. "And now, he wants to hurt my daughter." "I will not let that happen," Damon said, kneeling in front of her chair, his voice fierce with a certainty he had not felt about anything in a long while. "I promise you, Elena, whatever it costs me, I will not let him touch either of you." Elena looked up at him, tears finally spilling freely down her face. 5 years of careful, guarded strength cracking open, all at once, under the weight of a truth she had waited far too long to learn. "I believed I was protecting Mira by staying away from powerful men and their promises," she said, her voice breaking. "I did not know the danger had already found us regardless." "It has not found you yet," Damon said steadily, taking her trembling hands in his own. "And it will not. Not while I have breath left to prevent it." Elena wiped her eyes and forced herself to breathe, old instincts for careful survival, reasserting themselves even through the shock. "What proof do you have?" she asked. "You cannot move against your own cousin, a member of your own council, on suspicion alone." "I have a witness," Damon said. "A former guard who was present the day Aldrich died, who saw Callum strike the fatal blow himself. He has agreed to testify before the full council, though I understand the danger that places him in as well." "One witness," Elena said slowly, her healer's mind, trained to weigh evidence carefully before committing to any remedy, already working through the problem. "Against a man who has spent years building loyalty among your council. Will that be enough?" "I do not know," Damon admitted. "It may need to be, or it may need to be combined with something more, some piece of evidence that connects him directly, rather than through a single account, however credible." Elena was quiet for a moment, memory stirring uncomfortably. "Aldrich kept records," she said slowly. "Personal notes, in a small ledger he carried with him during his work as a messenger. I assumed it was lost or destroyed the day he died. But if it survived somehow, if it was recovered among his belongings and simply never examined closely." Damon straightened, new urgency sharpening his attention. "What belongings were returned to you?" "A small trunk," Elena said. "I have not opened it fully in years. It was too painful, in the early days, and afterward, I suppose I simply stopped thinking of it as anything more than a box of grief I did not wish to disturb." "Elena," Damon's voice was careful but insistent. If that ledger is in that trunk, it may be exactly the evidence we need. Elena rose slowly, some of her old strength returning to her spine even through the lingering shock of everything she had just learned. Then we should look tonight, she said. I do not think either of us will sleep regardless. They moved to the small storage room at the back of the cottage, where a modest wooden trunk sat beneath a stack of folded blankets, undisturbed for years. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she lifted the lid, old grief rising unbidden at the sight of Aldrich's few remaining possessions. A worn coat, a pair of boots, a small collection of personal letters she had never had the heart to reread. Beneath these, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect it from damp, she found a small leather ledger, its pages filled with Aldrich's careful, cramped handwriting. Damon knelt beside her as she opened it, both of them scanning the pages by candlelight, and within moments, they found what they were searching for. Detailed notes describing suspicious patterns in supply movements along the border, dates and names cross-referenced with troubling precision, culminating in a final entry, written just days before his death, naming Callum directly as the source of information being passed to Iron Hollow in exchange for future political support, once the border dispute favored the rival pack. This is it, Damon said quietly, something fierce and grim settling into his expression. This is exactly what we needed. Elena stared down at her husband's careful, damning handwriting. 5 years of grief and unanswered questions, finally resolving into a shape that was both a relief and a fresh wound all at once. He knew, she said softly. He knew what he had found, and he still carried it forward anyway, knowing the danger. He died protecting this kingdom's honesty, Damon said gently, echoing Garrick's words from earlier that day, without yet explaining their source. Mira should know that one day, her father was no careless victim of politics. He was brave enough to carry the truth forward, even when it cost him everything. From the doorway, a small voice interrupted them both. Mama? Elena turned quickly to find Mira, standing in her nightclothes, rubbing sleep from her eyes, drawn from bed by the murmur of voices and candlelight beneath the door. What are you looking at? Elena closed the ledger gently, wiping fresh tears from her own eyes, before drawing her daughter close. Something that belonged to your father, she said softly. Something that shows how brave he truly was. Mira looked between her mother's tear-streaked face and Damon's grim, determined expression, some instinct telling her this was not a moment for further questions, and simply pressed herself into her mother's embrace instead, accepting the comfort without needing every detail explained. Damon watched the two of them together, mother and daughter bound by grief and love in equal measure, and felt his resolve harden further. Whatever it cost him politically, whatever risk it carried, he would see this evidence before the full council, and he would ensure that Callum finally answered for everything he had taken from this family. Outside, the guards kept careful watch over the dark road, unaware of the depth of the conversation unfolding within the small cottage, unaware that the quiet, careful world Elena had built for herself and her daughter over 5 long years had just cracked open entirely, revealing a danger far larger and far closer than either of them had ever suspected, and a bond between two wounded people, now bound together by something far stronger than simple affection. The ledger slipped from Damon's saddlebag the next morning and struck the cottage floor with a sound sharp enough to make Elena's heart lurch before she even understood what had fallen. Careful, she said, bending quickly to retrieve it, checking the fragile pages for damage. This cannot be lost now, not after everything. It will not be, Damon said, taking it gently from her hands and securing it properly this time. I intend to present it to the full council within days, alongside Garrick's testimony. But Elena, before I do that, there is something else I need to tell you, something I have carried since before I learned the truth about Aldrich. Elena studied his face, noting the careful, uncertain way he approached whatever this was, so different from the steady confidence he had shown while discussing Callum's betrayal. What is it? Damon reached into his coat and withdrew the small wooden bird, setting it carefully on the table between them. I found this among the palace linens, before I returned it to you. I opened it, intending only to determine who it belonged to, before arranging its return. Elena's stomach tightened with sudden unease. And? Mira had written something inside, Damon said quietly. A letter, addressed to me. Elena's face paled, understanding beginning to dawn, even before he explained further. What did it say? Damon hesitated only a moment before answering honestly, having decided already that Elena deserved the full truth, however uncomfortable, especially now that so much else between them had already been laid bare. She wrote that you smile more since I began visiting, even when you try to hide it. She wrote that she remembers you crying at night after Aldrich died, and that you do not do that as much anymore. She asked me not to give up on you, even when you kept sending me away. Elena sat very still, color draining, and then rushing back into her face in equal measure. Mortification, and something far more complicated washing over her at once. She wrote that, she said slowly, and hid it in her bird, and sent it to you, without telling me any of it. I believe she hoped it would help, Damon said gently. She is very perceptive for a child her age. She noticed things about your grief that you likely believed you had hidden from her entirely. Elena pressed both hands over her face, a mixture of embarrassment and painful tenderness overwhelming her all at once. I have tried so hard to protect her from my own sorrow, she said, her voice muffled behind her hands. I did not want her carrying my grief along with her own loss of a father she barely remembers. She carries it regardless, Damon said, not unkindly. Children notice far more than we credit them for, Elena. She was not trying to interfere in matters beyond her understanding. She was trying to help the mother she loves find happiness again, in the only way a 6-year-old knows how. Elena lowered her hands slowly, tears standing bright in her eyes though they did not fall. Why did you not tell me sooner? You have known for days. Because I did not know how to tell you without also telling you what it made me begin investigating, Damon admitted. Reading her letter made me understand, for the first time, how deep your fear truly ran, deeper than simple caution about powerful men. It made me want to understand exactly what you were protecting her from. That is what led me to Aldrich's records, to Garrick's testimony, to everything we have uncovered together over these past days. Elena absorbed this slowly, the pieces settling into place with an uncomfortable but undeniable logic. So my daughter's secret letter is the reason you finally learned the truth about her father's death. Yes, Damon said simply. I am sorry I did not tell you immediately. I worried it would feel like an invasion of something private between you and Mira, something I had no right to have read at all. You did not have the right, Elena said, though there was no real anger in her voice, only a kind of exhausted, complicated honesty. But I understand why you kept it, and why you needed time to decide how to share it. They sat together in a silence that felt different from the many silences that had passed between them before. Heavier, with everything now openly acknowledged. Lighter, somehow, for no longer being hidden. Elena reached out finally, and lifted the small wooden bird from the table, turning it over in her hands, thinking of her daughter's careful, hopeful handwriting, of a child's simple, fierce wish for her mother's happiness. She should not have had to write that letter at all, Elena said quietly. She should not have felt she needed to fix something so far beyond what a child her age should carry. Perhaps not, Damon said, but she loves you enough to try regardless. That is not something to be ashamed of, Elena. It is something to be grateful for. Elena set the bird down gently and looked up at him, something in her expression finally, fully unguarded for the first time since his first knock on her door weeks before. I have spent 5 years building walls to keep everyone at a safe distance, she said. I told myself it was for Mira's protection, and it was, in part, but it was also for my own protection, because I did not believe I could survive losing someone again, the way I lost Aldrich. And now? Damon asked quietly. Now I understand that walls do not actually keep danger out, Elena said. They only keep out the people who might have helped carry the weight of it. Aldrich died because he was brave enough to carry an uncomfortable truth forward. I do not wish to spend the rest of my life being too afraid to carry anything at all. Damon reached across the table and took her hand, and this time Elena did not pull away. I cannot promise you a life without risk, he said. Not as long as Callum remains a threat, and not simply because I wear a crown that will always carry some danger with it. But I can promise you that you will not carry any of it alone. Not anymore, if you are willing to let me stand beside you. Elena studied their joined hands for a long moment, feeling the last of her careful resistance finally, fully give way. Mira already decided this for both of us, it seems, she said, a small watery laugh escaping, despite everything. Weeks ago, apparently, in a letter I was never meant to see. She is a very wise child, Damon said, warmth breaking through the gravity of the morning for the first time. She takes after her father in that, Elena said softly. He always did see things more clearly than I gave him credit for, until it was too late to tell him so. They sat together as the morning light strengthened through the small window, the wooden bird resting between them on the table, its secret finally, fully shared, and Elena felt something settle in her chest that she had not felt in 5 long years. Not safety exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that no longer required walls to survive. Their quiet moment was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps outside, one of Damon's guards calling urgently from beyond the door. Damon rose immediately, old instincts sharpening at the tone of alarm in the man's voice, and Elena followed close behind, as he opened the door, to find the guard breathless, having ridden hard from the palace. "My king," the guard said, "you must return immediately. Callum has learned of Garrick's testimony. He has already begun moving against the council, claiming treason charges of his own, accusing you of fabricating evidence to remove a rival from your path." Damon's expression went cold and still, the fragile peace of the morning shattering instantly under the weight of what was coming. "Where is Garrick now?" "Secured, as you ordered. But Callum's supporters are demanding he be produced publicly, and soon, or they will claim the witness does not exist at all." Damon turned back to Elena, urgency and reluctance warring plainly across his face. "I must return to the palace. Then I will come with you," Elena said immediately, already reaching for her cloak. "Whatever is about to happen, I will not let you face it without the one piece of evidence that ties everything together beyond doubt." She lifted Aldrich's ledger from the table, holding it close, and for the first time in 5 years, felt something other than grief when she looked at her husband's handwriting. Felt instead a fierce, protective determination to see his truth finally brought into the light, whatever the cost. "Are you certain?" Damon asked. "Once this becomes public, there will be no going back to a quiet life at the edge of the territory. Callum will not forgive whoever exposes him, and neither will his allies." "I have hidden long enough," Elena said, meeting his eyes steadily. "Mira deserves to grow up knowing the truth about her father, and I deserve to stop being afraid of a danger that never actually left when I ran from it 5 years ago. Whatever comes next, I would rather face it standing beside you than hiding from it alone." Before they departed, Elena hurried to Mira's room, waking her gently and explaining, as calmly as she could manage, that she needed to go to the palace with Damon, and that Mira would stay with Nora until she returned. Mira, still groggy with sleep, accepted this with the easy trust of a child who had learned to feel safe in her mother's careful hands, though something in her sharp, perceptive gaze lingered on her mother's face, a moment longer than usual, as though sensing the weight behind the calm explanation. "Is it about the king?" Mira asked, clutching her wooden bird against her chest. "It is about your father," Elena said gently, kneeling beside the bed. "I am going to help make sure people finally know how brave he truly was. I will explain everything when I return, I promise." Mira nodded slowly, solemn in the way only children manage when they sense something important, without fully understanding its shape. "Be careful, Mama." "I will," Elena said, pressing a kiss to her daughter's forehead before hurrying her, half-dressed and still clutching her bird, next door to Nora's waiting arms. Nora asked no questions beyond a single searching look at Elena's face, simply gathering Mira close and promising to keep her safe and occupied until word came. The ride to the palace passed in tense, hurried silence, Elena gripping the ledger against her chest with one arm and the reins with the other, her mind racing through everything that awaited them. The accusations Callum had already begun leveling, the danger to Garrick, the uncertain reception the full council might give to evidence delivered by a king already suspected of favoring a woman he was rumored to have grown close to. She understood, riding hard through the gray morning light, that whatever she carried into that council chamber would be scrutinized, not only for its truth, but for every possible motive that might be assigned to her presenting it. Damon rode close beside her, his expression set and grim, occasionally glancing her way, as though to reassure himself she remained steady, despite the pace and the danger ahead. Neither of them spoke much during the ride, the weight of what awaited them leaving little room for words, though once, as they crested the final hill before the palace gates came into view, he reached across the distance between their horses and briefly touched her hand where it gripped the reins. "Whatever happens in that chamber," he said. You will not stand alone in it. Elena met his eyes and nodded once, drawing strength from the certainty in his voice, and together they rode the final stretch toward the palace gates, where already a tense crowd of guards and council members had begun to gather, word of the unfolding crisis spreading quickly through every corridor and courtyard. As they dismounted, Edwin appeared at the gates to meet them, his face tight with urgency. Callum has called an emergency session, he said quickly, falling into step beside Damon as they crossed the courtyard. He means to present his own accusations before you have the chance to present yours. If we do not move quickly, he will control how this story is first heard, and that alone may sway enough of the council to his side, regardless of what evidence follows. Then we will not give him the chance to speak first, Damon said, his voice hardening with resolve. Gather the council now. I will not wait for Callum to set the terms of this reckoning. Elena tightened her grip on the ledger, feeling the eyes of gathering guards and curious servants following her across the courtyard, whispers already beginning at the sight of the healer, from the edge of the territory, walking beside the king with such evident purpose. She held her head high despite the attention, thinking of Aldrich's careful handwriting pressed against her chest, of Mira's fierce, hopeful letter hidden away weeks earlier in a small wooden bird, of every reason she had to stand here now, rather than hide away as she once might have done. Whatever waited beyond the great doors of the council chamber, she was no longer the frightened widow who had turned a king away from her door again and again. She was ready, finally, to fight for the truth her husband had died protecting. The council chamber erupted into shouting the moment Elena stepped through the doors beside Damon, dozens of voices rising at once, and Callum's rang loudest above them all. "There she is!" Callum said, pointing directly at Elena with an expression of practiced outrage. "The very woman my cousin has been secretly favoring for weeks, now brought before this council, to lend false weight to fabricated accusations against me. Is this truly the evidence you intend to present, Damon? A commoner with every reason to invent a story that flatters your affections?" "Sit down, Callum," Damon said, his voice carrying easily across the chamber despite its quiet control. "You will have your chance to speak. Right now, this council will hear the truth, in full, before anyone renders judgment on anything." Callum's jaw tightened, but he retreated to his seat, arms folded, a careful mask of wounded innocence settling over his features as the council quieted enough for Damon to begin. 5 years ago, Aldrich Voss died during the Iron Hollow border negotiations, Damon said, his voice steady and clear enough to reach every corner of the chamber. The official account claimed his death resulted from a violent dispute between negotiating parties. That account was false. Murmurs rippled through the gathered council, and Damon continued before the noise could grow too loud to speak over. "I have obtained testimony from a guard present that day, who witnessed Aldrich Voss struck down, not by any representative of Iron Hollow, but by a member of this very court. Baseless accusation," Callum called out. "Where is this mysterious witness? Produce him, if he exists at all." "He will be produced," Damon said calmly. "But first, this council should see what Aldrich Voss himself recorded in the days before his death." He gestured toward Elena, who stepped forward, her hands steady now despite the pounding of her heart, and opened the small leather ledger to the marked page. "My husband kept detailed records of his work," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly, despite years of never having addressed anything larger than a village gathering. In the final entry, written days before his death, he documented evidence that someone within this court was passing sensitive information to Iron Hollow in exchange for future political support. She read the entry aloud, her voice growing steadier with each word. Aldrich's careful, damning account of dates, meetings, and patterns of leaked information, culminating in his direct identification of Callum as the source of the betrayal. The chamber fell utterly silent as she finished, all eyes turning toward Callum, whose carefully maintained composure had begun, for the first time, to show visible cracks. "A dead man's private notes," Callum said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Written by a grieving widow's late husband, conveniently discovered years after the fact, exactly when it proves useful to discredit me. Forgive me if I do not find this compelling." "Then perhaps you will find this compelling instead," Damon said, and at his signal, the chamber doors opened once more, and Garrick stepped through, his face pale but resolute, flanked by 2 guards Damon had assigned for his protection. Garrick's testimony followed, delivered in a clear, steady voice that carried the unmistakable weight of a man finally releasing a burden he had carried far too long alone. He described the day of Aldrich's death in careful detail, his position during the negotiations, the moment Callum drew Aldrich aside, the sound of a struggle, the sight of Aldrich's body moments later, and the swift, convenient reassignment that had followed his own silence. "I was young and frightened," Garrick said, his voice breaking slightly. "I believed staying silent would keep me safe. I have carried the weight of that silence for 5 years, watching a widow raise her daughter alone, believing a lie about how her husband died. I will not carry it any longer." The council chamber erupted once more, this time with a different quality of noise, shock, and outrage, directed increasingly toward Callum, rather than toward the accusation itself. Callum rose from his seat, his composure fully broken now, anger flashing openly across his face. "This is a coordinated attack," he said, his voice rising. "A widow with a grudge, a guard bribed or threatened into false testimony, all orchestrated by a king, desperate to discredit his own cousin, because that cousin dared question his judgment in open council. I demand this council see this, for the conspiracy it truly is." "The only conspiracy in this chamber," Damon said, his voice cutting through Callum's rising anger with cold, deliberate precision, "is the one you orchestrated 5 years ago, and have spent every year since carefully protecting. You murdered an innocent man, who discovered your betrayal of this crown. You silenced a witness through quiet threat disguised as promotion, and when you learned that the widow you left behind might somehow connect back to that truth, you began investigating her past, hoping to find some way to discredit or eliminate her before she became a danger to you. You have no proof of that final claim," Callum said, though his voice had lost nearly all its earlier certainty. "I have servants who witnessed your inquiries," Edwin said, stepping forward from where he had been standing near the chamber's edge. Discreet questions about Elena Voss's history, sent through intermediaries, in the days following the king's renewed interest in her husband's death. The timing alone speaks clearly enough to anyone willing to see it honestly. Silence fell over the chamber, heavy and absolute, as the full weight of the accumulated evidence settled over the gathered council. Callum looked around at the faces surrounding him, searching for allies, for support he had spent years carefully cultivating, and found instead only wary, uncertain expressions, men and women, recalculating their loyalties in real time, as the shape of the truth became impossible to ignore. "This council will convene to review all evidence formally," the eldest council member said finally, breaking the silence with the careful, measured tone of long practice. "But I will say plainly, Lord Callum, that what has been presented here today carries a weight that cannot simply be dismissed as coincidence or conspiracy against you." Callum's eyes swept the chamber one final time, calculating, searching for some remaining path forward, before settling on Damon with an expression that had finally, fully abandoned any pretense of innocence. "You will regret this," he said quietly, words meant only for his cousin, though they carried clearly enough in the silent chamber for others nearby to hear. "Whatever you think you have won today, this crown has cost you more than you yet understand. The only thing I regret," Damon said evenly, "is that it took 5 years to bring you to this chamber, and that an innocent man paid with his life for your ambition in the meantime." Guards moved forward at Damon's signal, and Callum was led from the chamber under formal arrest, his protests growing quieter as the doors closed behind him, the full council left to sit with the enormous weight of what had just been revealed within their own ranks. Elena stood very still amid the chaos settling slowly into order around her, the ledger still clutched against her chest, 5 years of grief and unanswered questions finally, fully resolved in the space of a single morning. Damon crossed to her side, his expression softening from the cold, controlled fury he had shown Callum into something gentler, more uncertain, as though only now allowing himself to feel the full relief of what had just been accomplished. "It is done," he said quietly. "Whatever comes next in the formal proceedings, the truth is finally known." Elena looked up at him, tears standing in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. "My husband can finally rest, knowing his sacrifice was not forgotten," she said. "Thank you, Damon, for believing me worth this fight, even before you knew everything it would require." "You were never a fight I needed convincing to take on," Damon said softly. You were simply someone worth returning to, again and again, for as long as it took. Around them, the council chamber slowly emptied, whispers and hurried conversations trailing out into the corridors, as word of the morning's revelations spread quickly through the palace and beyond, toward every corner of Blackthorn territory, and eventually, toward a small cottage at its edge where a young girl waited, clutching a small wooden bird, for her mother's safe return. Damon insisted on riding back with Elena himself once the immediate business of securing Callum and calming the shaken council had been managed, unwilling to let her make the journey alone after everything the day had already asked of her. They rode in a quieter silence than the tense one that had carried them toward the palace that morning, something settled and easier passing between them now that the truth no longer hung unspoken over every conversation. "What happens to him now?" Elena asked, as the cottage finally came into view ahead of them. "A formal trial before the full council," Damon said. "Given the severity of the charges, and given his standing, it cannot be a hasty judgment, however clear the evidence may seem today. But he will answer for what he has done, Elena. That much I can promise you with certainty." "I do not need him punished to feel at peace," Elena said slowly, considering her own feelings as she spoke them aloud for the first time. "I only needed to know the truth. Everything else feels, strangely, like it matters less than I expected it to." "Grief rarely resolves the way we imagine it will," Damon said gently. "I have found that the relief of finally understanding often outweighs whatever satisfaction we thought punishment might bring." They arrived at the cottage to find Nora already watching for them from her window, and within moments, Mira came running from next door, the wooden bird clutched tightly in one hand, her face breaking into open relief at the sight of her mother safely returned.
"Mama!"
Mira threw herself into Elena's arms the moment she dismounted, and Elena knelt to catch her fully, holding her daughter close, breathing in the familiar warmth of her, grateful beyond words for the simple, ordinary comfort of her presence. "I am here," Elena murmured into her daughter's hair. "I am safe, and everything is all right now." Mira pulled back slightly, studying her mother's face with the same searching perceptiveness she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. "Did you find out about Papa?" Elena glanced up at Damon, who gave a small, encouraging nod, before turning her full attention back to her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart. Your father was very brave. He found out something important, something that could have hurt a lot of people if it stayed hidden, and he tried to make sure the truth came out, even though it was dangerous." Mira's eyes widened, absorbing this new understanding of the father she barely remembered. "Is that why he died?" "Yes," Elena said softly, choosing honesty over the comfortable vagueness she had relied on for years. "Someone hurt him because they did not want the truth known, but today, because of what he wrote down, because he was brave enough to keep looking, even when it was dangerous, that same truth finally came out. He did not die for nothing, Mira. He died protecting something important, and today, we finally proved that to everyone." Mira considered this with the careful seriousness she brought to every important thing, then wrapped her arms tightly around her mother's neck once more. "I am glad we know now," she said. "I think Papa would be happy that you are not scared anymore." Elena's breath caught, old grief and new relief tangling together in her chest, at her daughter's simple, perceptive words. "I think you are right," she said softly. Nora approached slowly, her expression a mixture of relief and barely contained curiosity, though she held her questions for the moment, simply embracing Elena warmly instead. "The whole village will be talking about this by nightfall," she said. "But that can wait. Are you all right?" "I am better than all right," Elena said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it fully. Damon lingered near the cottage gate, giving mother and daughter their moment of reunion, without intruding, though Mira soon turned her attention to him as well, releasing her mother to approach him directly, the wooden bird still clutched in her small hand. "Thank you for helping Mama," she said solemnly, "and for reading my letter, even though I did not mean for you to find it exactly like that." Damon knelt to her level, something warm and unguarded in his expression. "Your letter helped me understand something important," he said. "I am glad it found its way to me, even if it happened by accident." Mira studied him for a moment longer, then glanced back at her mother, a small, knowing smile crossing her young face, far too knowing, Elena thought, for a child her age. "Does this mean you will keep coming to visit us now? Without Mama having to say yes every time first?" Damon laughed softly, glancing toward Elena with a question in his eyes that went considerably deeper than Mira's simple phrasing suggested. "That depends entirely on your mother," he said, "but I hope so, more than I can easily say." Elena felt her face warm under both their gazes, old habits of careful deflection rising briefly before she set them aside deliberately, choosing instead to answer honestly. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am finally ready to stop saying no, simply because saying yes frightens me." Mira's face lit with unrestrained delight at this, and even Nora, standing nearby, could not hide her pleased smile at the quiet shift that had clearly settled over the small gathering. Damon's expression softened further, something in his posture easing, as though a long-held tension had finally begun to release. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, meeting Elena's eyes, "we might discuss what comes next, once the dust of today has properly settled." "Perhaps we might," Elena agreed, and for the first time since Aldrich's death, the words did not feel like a door closing, but one finally, carefully opening. The trial lasted 3 full days, and Elena sat through every hour of it, watching the careful, methodical unraveling of 5 years of buried betrayal laid bare before the full council of Blackthorn. Callum offered no confession, maintaining his innocence to the very end, though the weight of evidence, Garrick's steady testimony, Aldrich's damning ledger, the confirmed accounts of servants who had witnessed his careful inquiries into Elena's past, proved impossible for even his most loyal remaining allies to explain away. On the final day, the council delivered its judgment, stripping Callum of his title and lands, exiling him permanently from Blackthorn territory under guard, forbidden ever to return. Elena watched him led away for the final time with a strange, quiet detachment, expecting to feel triumph, or perhaps lingering anger, and finding instead only a settled kind of peace, the sense of a long, heavy chapter finally closing. Aldrich's name was formally cleared before the full council that same day, his sacrifice recognized officially for the first time in 5 years, and a small pension was arranged for Elena and Mira, in recognition of what her husband had given for the kingdom's honesty. Edwin approached her afterward, his usual careful formality softened by genuine warmth. "I want you to know," he said, "that I doubted the wisdom of the king's visits to your cottage, when they first began. I worried they were a distraction from matters that mattered more to this kingdom's stability. I was wrong, Elena Voss. What you and your daughter brought to light this week may well have saved this crown from a betrayal that could have festered for years longer, had it stayed buried. I did not do it alone," Elena said. "Garrick's courage, Aldrich's careful records, your own diligence in finding the old files. It took all of it together." "Perhaps," Edwin allowed, a small smile crossing his usually solemn face. "But it took your courage to walk into that chamber and read your husband's words aloud, in front of a council that might easily have dismissed you. That is not a small thing, whatever else contributed to the outcome." "It does not undo what was lost," Damon said quietly, as they walked together from the council chamber that final evening. "But it is what justice can offer, at least." "It is enough," Elena said, and found, once again, that she meant the words fully. "Mira will grow up knowing her father was brave, not merely unlucky. That matters more to me than any punishment Callum receives." In the weeks that followed, life in Blackthorn territory settled slowly back into its ordinary rhythms, though nothing about Elena's small cottage remained quite as it had been before. Damon's visits continued, no longer shadowed by careful secrecy or court suspicion, but openly, warmly acknowledged by nearly everyone who had once whispered about them. Nora took great satisfaction in reminding Elena, at every opportunity, that she had predicted this outcome from the very beginning. Mira flourished in the steady presence of a household no longer weighted by careful, unspoken fear. Her health continued to improve fully, her letters grew steadier, and her laughter, Elena noticed with quiet joy, came easier and more often than it had in years, no longer shadowed by the careful watchfulness of a child who had sensed her mother's hidden grief without fully understanding it. Elena also found, in those quiet weeks, that her own work as a healer did not need to end simply because her circumstances had changed. She continued treating villagers who sought her out, now with access to rarer herbs and remedies through the palace stores, and she began quietly training 2 younger women from the village in the careful art of preparing tinctures and remedies, ensuring that her years of hard-earned knowledge would not be lost, even as her own life expanded into rooms far larger than her small cottage had ever been. One evening, nearly 2 months after Callum's exile, Damon arrived at the cottage carrying something other than medicine or reassurance, for the first time since his very first visit. Elena noticed immediately the careful, uncharacteristic nervousness in his manner as he settled at the small table, glancing more than once toward Mira, who was curled by the fire with her wooden bird, seemingly absorbed in her own quiet game, though watching the adults with unmistakable interest. "You seem unusually quiet tonight," Elena said, setting a cup of tea in front of him, studying his face with growing curiosity. "I have something I wish to ask you," Damon said, setting the cup aside without drinking from it. "Something I have been considering for some weeks now, though I confess, I have found myself more nervous approaching this conversation than I was standing before the full council with Callum's fate at stake." Elena's heart began to beat a little faster, though she kept her voice carefully light. "That sounds serious." "It is," Damon said, and then, drawing a slow breath, he continued. "Elena, I did not come to your door originally intending anything beyond offering aid to a sick child. But in the months since, I have found that this cottage, and the two of you within it, have become the place I think of most, the place I most wish to return to, regardless of what business calls me elsewhere. I am not asking you to simply join my court as a healer, as I once clumsily proposed on our very first meeting. I am asking you to be my mate, Elena, to share my life fully, and to let me share in yours and Mira's, not as a king offering protection to a widow in need, but as a man who has come to love you both more than he ever expected to love anyone again." Elena's breath caught, old habits of careful caution rising briefly, before settling, this time, into something steadier and more certain. She thought of 5 years spent building walls against exactly this kind of vulnerability, of a daughter's hidden letter that had seen more clearly than she herself had allowed, of a husband's brave sacrifice finally honored, of a slow, careful trust built patiently over months of persistent, honest visits. "You said you would keep coming back," she said softly. "Even when I sent you away again and again, you never once gave up, even when I gave you every reason to." "I told you once that I make the rules I follow," Damon said, a small, hopeful smile touching his mouth, despite the evident weight of the moment. "I decided very early that giving up on you was not a rule I intended to follow." From her spot by the fire, Mira had gone very still, watching the exchange with wide, hopeful eyes, the wooden bird forgotten in her lap. Elena glanced toward her daughter, feeling the full weight of everything Mira had quietly hoped for, since long before either adult had been ready to admit it aloud. "Yes," Elena said, turning back to Damon, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I will be your mate. I am ready, finally, to stop being afraid of what happiness might cost me, and to simply let myself have it instead." Mira let out a delighted cry and launched herself across the room, throwing her arms around both of them at once, laughing in a way that filled the small cottage with a warmth it had not known in years. Damon caught her easily, lifting her up between them, and Elena felt tears of pure, uncomplicated joy finally spill down her face, grief and fear giving way, at last, to something she had once believed impossible to reclaim. "I knew it," Mira said, beaming at them both. "I knew if you kept coming back enough times, Mama would finally say yes." "You knew, did you?" Elena said, laughing through her tears, brushing her daughter's hair back fondly. "And here I thought I was the one making all the decisions in this house." "I wrote him a letter," Mira admitted, a touch of old guilt creeping into her proud smile. "I am sorry I did it in secret, Mama. I just wanted you to be happy again." "I know you did, sweetheart," Elena said, pulling her daughter close, meeting Damon's eyes over the top of Mira's head with a warmth that needed no further words. "And because of your letter, and because of how brave your father was, we finally have everything we need to be truly happy. You have nothing to apologize for, not ever." The wedding took place at the height of summer, in the same small village where Elena had once lived in careful, quiet isolation, surrounded now by neighbors who had watched her slow transformation with genuine affection, by a court that had come to respect the steady, honest partnership between their king and the healer he had refused to give up on, and by a little girl who stood proudly beside her mother throughout the ceremony, the small wooden bird tucked safely into the pocket of her new dress, its secret finally, fully known and celebrated rather than hidden away. Nora stood near the front of the gathered crowd, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and declaring loudly to anyone nearby that she had known this outcome from the very first week of the king's visits, a claim that drew fond laughter from those who remembered her far more uncertain gossip in the early days. Oren, the old farmer who had first warned Elena of the dangers along the eastern border, raised his cup in a toast to the health of the new royal family, while Dr. Hollis, who had saved Mira's life on the night that changed everything, stood proudly near the front, having been invited personally by Damon in recognition of that critical night. Garrick attended as well, no longer hiding in quiet exile at the border post where he had been sent years before, but restored fully to honored service, his courage in finally speaking the truth publicly celebrated rather than punished. He bowed deeply to Elena as the ceremony concluded, and she took his hand warmly, thanking him again for the bravery that had helped bring her husband's memory the justice it deserved. Damon's coronation of Elena as his mate and queen followed within the same season, a formal recognition of everything the two of them had built together through months of careful trust and shared danger. And as she stood beside him before the full gathered court, Elena felt none of the old fear that had once kept her locked behind careful walls of grief and caution. Instead, she felt only the steady, quiet certainty of a woman who had finally allowed herself to be found, not because a king had simply pursued her patiently enough to wear down her resistance, but because a small, brave child had trusted her own perceptive heart enough to reach out and ask for what her mother had been too afraid to ask for herself. That evening, as the celebrations continued around them, Elena found a quiet moment alone with Mira on the palace balcony, watching the stars begin to appear over Blackthorn territory, her daughter's small hand held warmly in her own. "Are you happy, Mama?" Mira asked, leaning her head against her mother's side. Elena looked out over the kingdom that had once frightened her so deeply, now feeling, for the first time in years, entirely and fully at peace within it. "I am happier than I have been in a very long time," she said softly. "And I owe a great deal of that happiness to a very brave little girl, who hid a letter inside a wooden bird and trusted that it might change everything." Mira smiled up at her, content and certain in the way only a child who has finally seen her deepest wish come true can be. "I told you it would work," she said simply. "You did," Elena agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her daughter's head, the wooden bird resting safely on the balcony ledge beside them, its long journey finally, fully complete. "You certainly did."